March 25, 1944. At roll call, 76 names were missing. Snow still covered the barracks of Stalag Luft 3, the German camp built for Allied airmen who had dared to fall from the sky and survive. On most mornings, the guards counted quickly, bored, efficient, certain of control. But not this one. That morning, the officer in charge froze halfway through the list. The numbers didn't add up. He counted again. Then again. His voice began to crack. 76. 76? The silence that followed was heavier than the winter air. Prisoners stood in rows, motionless, faces blank. They'd practiced this silence for years. From the watchtower, a searchlight swept over the snow, over empty bunks, over footprints that went nowhere. Inside the commandanter, Major von Linde pounded his fist on the desk. It's not possible. No one escapes this camp. But they had. They'd said it couldn't be done. That Stalag Luft 3 was escape-proof. The floors were reinforced with concrete, microphones buried deep in the ground, guard towers watching every angle. The Germans had designed it precisely to stop the kind of men it now failed to contain. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were pilots, the most dangerous kind of captive, trained to navigate, to plan, to wait. And waiting was all they had done, until that night. A year earlier, the snow was thicker, the hunger worse, the boredom suffocating. The camp looked like any other, rows of huts, barbed wire, a gray sky without horizon. But beneath one of those huts, a handful of men had begun to dig. A soft scrape of a shovel, a breath, another scrape, then the faint thud of soil landing in a wooden box. The man leading them was Squadron Leader Roger Bushel, RAF, tall, intense, known by the prisoners as Big X. He had escaped twice before. Both times, the Gestapo caught him. Both times, he promised he would try again. They think we're caged birds, he told his men. We're moles. They believed him. Bushel's idea was madness even by camp standards. Not one tunnel, but 3. If one failed, the others would live. He called them Tom, Dick, and Harry. When news of the plan spread, it became an obsession. More than 600 men volunteered. Carpenters, engineers, tailors, and forgers. Every man had a job. Digging, pumping air, building traps, smuggling wood, or sewing civilian clothes from blankets. They dug with spoons, knives, even broken mess tins. They stole wood from their own bed slats to build tunnel supports. Every handful of sand had to disappear without a trace. They carried it inside their trousers, released it during walks, shuffling like penguins to scatter the dirt. The guards laughed at their clumsy gait. The British are getting soft, they said. They had no idea the men were hollowing out the earth beneath their feet. The first tunnel, Tom, nearly succeeded. Nearly. One afternoon, the roof sagged. A guard heard the thud. The search that followed was brutal. Dogs, picks, and rifles. When they broke into Tom, they found everything. Tools, timber, maps, even a small electric lamp powered by stolen wire. The commandant stood at the edge of the hole and muttered, ingenious and useless. But what he didn't know was that Tom was only one of 3. While guards filled the first tunnel with concrete, men elsewhere whispered and drew new maps. They simply started again. We keep digging, said Bushel. And so they did. By early 1944, Harry, the final tunnel, stretched over 100 meters beneath the wire. The air was thin, the walls barely holding. But it was there, a passage from captivity to the dark forest beyond. Every day, Bushel counted the meters, the men, the food rations. He knew the risk. They all did. Yet the act itself had become larger than freedom. It was defiance carved into the soil. When the Germans realized what had happened, when they saw that yawning black hole just beyond Hut 104, the camp erupted in chaos. Sirens screamed. Dogs barked. Spotlights swept the snow. Inside the huts, the remaining prisoners sat quietly, hands folded on their knees. Some smiled. Some wept. They'd done it. For one night. Just one. The world outside the barbed wire was theirs again. That night, the guards dug for answers. The prisoners sat in silence. And beneath the frozen ground, a legend began to breathe. But this story didn't begin that night. It began with a handful of sand. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They built an entire city underground, with spoons. By spring 1943, Stalag Luft 3 had become less a prison and more a construction site disguised as boredom. Every day, hundreds of Allied airmen played their parts, reading, exercising, playing chess, while beneath their feet, another world was taking shape. It began with a single hole under Hut 104, a space barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. The first diggers worked by touch alone, breathing dust, sweating into the sand. One man would scrape, another would fill the tin box, a third would crawl backward to haul it out. All in silence. They called the first tunnel Tom. Then came Dick. Then Harry. 3 tunnels. 3 lifelines. It was Roger Bushell's idea, Big X, the man who believed no camp was escape-proof. In his words, if one man gets out, it's victory for him. If 200 do, it's a victory for us all. The camp was built to stop precisely this. The Germans had buried microphones around the perimeter to detect digging. They raised the barracks off the ground to make hiding harder. They even put the compound on sandy soil, soft enough to collapse any tunnel before it could go far. So the prisoners adapted. They stole wooden boards from their own beds to shore up the tunnels. They smuggled tin cans from the kitchen and built air ducts. They scavenged copper wire from broken radios, creating an underground electrical grid powered by the camp's stolen generator lines. They called it the firm. Each tunnel had a specific function. Tom, the main escape route. Dick, storage, maps, forged papers, and tools. Harry, the backup. If one died, the others lived on. Inside, they built chambers wide enough to crouch. The air was thick, heavy with sweat and candle smoke. Each night, they took shifts to keep digging. Men would come back from their turn underground shaking, gasping for air, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Private Alan Hill later wrote, "It wasn't courage that kept us going. It was boredom and pride." But for every hour spent underground, they faced the same problem above it: what to do with the sand. The yellow clay from the tunnels didn't match the surface soil. Dumping it openly would be suicide. So they invented the penguin system. Prisoners filled small cloth bags with sand and tied strings to the bottoms of their trousers. During exercise walks, they released it little by little, shuffling around the yard as if stretching their legs. To the guards, it looked ridiculous. To the prisoners, it was survival. Each man became part of a machine. Some stole civilian clothes from the camp laundry. Others forged passports, printed fake stamps using potatoes, or made compasses from razor blades and melted phonograph needles. They even crafted train tickets by hand, using colored pencils. Every detail mattered. Every mistake meant death. When Tom reached 30 meters, disaster struck. A guard stumbled upon a hidden trapdoor during a surprise search. Within minutes, soldiers were swarming Hut 123, digging down with rifles in hand. The tunnel was destroyed. For a moment, everything stopped. Men sat on their bunks, silent. The dream of escape, crushed again. Bushell called a meeting that night in the washroom, the only place without microphones. Rain hammered on the tin roof. He stood by the door and spoke quietly. They found Tom. Then we dig Harry. No one argued. They simply nodded and went back to work. If the first tunnel had been built on hope, the second was built on anger. They dug deeper this time, nearly 9 meters down, far below the reach of German microphones. The entrance was hidden under a stove, so carefully disguised that even during random inspections, no one noticed the faint vibration in the floor. The deeper they went, the stranger it felt. Men joked they were closer to Australia than to freedom. They sweated through shirts, carved their initials into the walls, sang under their breath to stay sane. The tunnel stretched farther each week, 100 meters of wood and air and faith. Above ground, life went on. Roll calls, inspections, snow, hunger. The Germans thought the camp had grown docile. They even loosened patrols. In truth, the earth below them was alive, breathing, growing, waiting. By late 1943, the tunnels had consumed everything the camp could offer. Bed frames vanished. Kitchen pots went missing. Even Red Cross tins were stripped for parts. The guards started calling the prisoners rats. The men took it as a compliment. A new rhythm filled the camp. The quiet sound of digging during the night. The faint rattle of sand during the day. Each bucket of earth was a small act of war. Each stolen nail, a declaration of independence. They weren't just escaping a camp. They were escaping humiliation itself, proving that even in defeat, they could outthink their captors. When the winter wind began to creep through the cracks of the barracks, the men of Stalag Luft 3 didn't complain. They whispered to each other instead, smiling through frostbitten lips. By spring, Harry will be ready. They didn't know that in the forest outside the camp, the Gestapo was already watching. The hunters were waiting for the prey that hadn't even emerged. And soon, the digging would end. Because freedom was about to begin. It was snowing. The moon was full. And under the snow, a hole to freedom. The night of March 24th, 1944, began like every other at Stalag Luft 3. Guards paced the perimeter. Searchlights swung lazily through the trees. The prisoners, officially, were asleep. Unofficially, 76 men were crawling through the earth. Inside Hut 104, the stove had been moved aside. Beneath it, hidden under boards and blankets, was the mouth of Harry, a tunnel no wider than a coffin. A hand-painted sign read, "To London," half joke, half prayer. The first man, Lieutenant Jimmy James, slid in headfirst, boots tied to his belt, a small candle clamped between his teeth. The air was cold, dry, and tasted like chalk. Behind him, another man waited, counting under his breath. Every 10 minutes, a new man went down. The system ran like a machine, quiet, precise, terrifyingly fragile. The tunnel was deeper than anyone remembered. It took 30 minutes to crawl through, using a rope line to stay oriented in the darkness. Air was pumped through tin pipes made from powdered milk cans, every hiss echoing like thunder underground. Above, the camp was silent except for the creak of snow-laden trees. A guard coughed. A dog barked. Then, nothing. For the men inside Harry, time dissolved. There was only the scrape of boots and the heartbeat in their ears. After nearly an hour, James saw a faint glow ahead, the exit. He crawled faster, freezing hands clutching the rope. Then, suddenly, he stopped. The tunnel wasn't finished. They had miscalculated. When he broke the surface, he realized they hadn't reached the safety of the forest. The exit hole lay 20 feet short, right in front of the outer fence, in full view of the guard towers. James froze, half in, half out of the snow. One wrong move, one shout, and everything would be lost. He waited. Minutes passed. The wind picked up, blowing snow across the ground. The floodlights swung away. He whispered down the tunnel. "We're short, but we go." And so they did. From 10 p.m. until 3 a.m., they came, one by one, crawling from darkness to moonlight. Each man carried forged papers, a compass, and a ration tin. They ran low, crouching, vanishing into the treeline. Some turned north, toward the Baltic. Others west, toward France. It was mechanical, practiced, rehearsed 100 times in whispers. And yet, every escape was a miracle. Inside the hut, the next group waited for the tug on the rope, their signal to go. The air was thick with sweat and kerosene. Someone whispered a prayer. Another man vomited quietly into a bucket. Then, the rope moved. A cheer almost escaped their throats, but discipline held. One by one, they slid into the earth. By midnight, 30 men had gone. By 2 a.m., 50. At 4 a.m., the rope stopped moving. A distant sound, shouting. Then a gunshot. Another. The line went slack. Panic surged through the hut. They didn't know what had happened, whether someone was caught or killed, whether the guards had found the hole. But there was no way to check. A British officer hissed, "Seal it. Now." They closed the stove, shoved the boards back, and sat on their bunks, pretending to sleep. Outside, the floodlights came alive. Dogs barked. The sirens began to wail. By dawn, the snow around the fence was a maze of footprints. Guards shouted, rifles slung over their shoulders. Search parties began within minutes. Planes were called in. Trains were halted. Germany, for one day, forgot the war and hunted ghosts. At first, they thought only a few had escaped. Then the numbers started coming in. 10 missing. 20. 50. 76. Major von Linde stood at roll call, the list shaking in his hands. 76. Unmöglich. He kicked over a chair. The guards stared at the prisoners, expecting laughter, celebration, something. But there was nothing. The men stood in perfect silence, their faces unreadable. Inside the command tent, the phone lines buzzed. Orders came from Berlin. The camp was sealed. Roads closed. Patrols dispatched to every nearby town. The Gestapo arrived by noon. "They will be found," one officer said coldly. "Every last one." And they were. One by one, The escapees were captured on trains, at checkpoints, in barns. Some were betrayed by locals. Others simply starved or froze before reaching safety. Of the 76 who made it out, 73 were caught. 50 were executed on Hitler's orders, shot in the back on transfer. Only 3 made it to freedom, 2 to Sweden, 1 to Spain. Back in the camp, the men learned of the killings weeks later. A smuggled radio caught a BBC broadcast mentioning the mass escape and the reprisals. The barracks fell silent. Someone whispered, 50 gone for what? And another voice answered quietly, for proof that we were still men. That spring, the Gestapo dug up Harry, filling the tunnel with concrete. They sealed Hut 104 and turned it into a warning. But even as they did, the guards could feel it, the story spreading through every camp in Germany, every whisper of resistance, every Allied broadcast. It wasn't just an escape anymore. It was a message. Even buried under the snow, it wouldn't die. Because for 76 men, one night of freedom was worth everything that followed. And for the 50 who never came back, the war would remember them. Forever. At dawn, the snow still held their footprints. By noon, the Gestapo had theirs. The morning after the escape, the world around Stalag Luft 3 trembled with movement. Searchlights flickered over the forest. The air reeked of exhaust, gunpowder, and dogs. From the watchtowers, guards stared into the mist, rifles trembling in their hands. Somewhere out there, 76 Allied airmen were running, through woods, over rail lines, across frozen fields. Berlin was already on the line. The message from Himmler was short and absolute. No one is to reach freedom. Find them. All of them. Within hours, the largest manhunt in Nazi-occupied Europe had begun. Convoys of trucks fanned out from Sagan. Hundreds of SS, Gestapo, and local police combed the countryside. Trains were stopped, cars searched, papers checked. From the Baltic to Bavaria, the hunt grew like wildfire. Over 30,000 men were mobilized. Every village was warned. Report any strangers, any foreign speech, any smell of English tobacco. A German report later described the chaos with bitter admiration. We underestimated their will. They underestimated our vengeance. In the forest, 2 British officers crouched beneath pine branches, breath steaming in the cold. Their shoes were torn, their fingers bleeding from frostbite. Each time they heard dogs barking in the distance, they pressed their faces into the snow, praying for silence. By the second night, they reached a rail line. A freight train slowed as it climbed a hill. One man ran and leapt into an open coal car. The other followed. They lay buried in black dust, motionless. Hours later, the dogs came. Barking grew closer, sharper, echoing off the wooden cars. A flashlight beam cut across the coal. One shout in German. Then the crack of a rifle. The train rolled on, lighter by 2 souls. Elsewhere, 3 men disguised in stolen overcoats reached a small station near Breslau. They bought tickets using forged passes, printed in the camp by candlelight weeks earlier. They smiled, nodded, acted calm. It almost worked. At the last checkpoint, an officer noticed the paper's edge, too clean. He tore it once, felt the weight, and smiled. The next sound was the metallic click of a Luger. By the end of the first day, 20 men were caught. By the third, 40. By the end of 2 weeks, 73. The Gestapo tracked them through snow, rumors, and exhaustion. Some were caught in barns, others in city squares, betrayed for bread or fear. One pair was discovered sleeping in a church. Another froze to death before the patrol even reached them. A handful nearly made it. 2 Norwegians reached Sweden by fishing boat. A Dutch pilot, Bram van der Stok, slipped across France using the resistance network, the only one to make it home to England. But for the rest, the walls of Europe had closed again. Inside Stalag Luft 3, the men who remained were ordered outside for roll call. Guards paced with rifles ready. A Gestapo officer read names, crossing them off one by one. Each name felt like a heartbeat fading. The prisoners didn't speak. They stood shoulder to shoulder, faces set against the wind. They had escaped one prison, only to find a larger one called Europe. That afternoon, in his Berlin office, Heinrich Himmler read the final report. Snow melted off his boots, dripping onto the paper. 73 captured, 3 missing. His signature was precise, deliberate, cruel. Special handling, he wrote. 2 words. 50 deaths. He set down the pen, closed the file, and looked out the window toward the gray Reich sky. The hunt was over. But for the prisoners, the nightmare had just begun. They thought they were going home. Instead, they were driven into the woods. April 1944. The manhunt had ended. The paperwork began. The 73 recaptured airmen were logged, numbered, and placed in police cells across Germany. Some were handed coffee in chipped mugs. Some were told they'd be returned to camp for discipline. At dawn, trucks arrived. Small groups were loaded under guard, 2, 3, sometimes 4 men at a time, and driven out on country roads that cut through quiet fields and thin stands of pine. No destination was listed. Only a phrase repeated from driver to driver, Sonderbehandlung. Special handling. Near Gorlitz, a car pulled onto a lay-by. The sky was the color of tin. One officer stepped out to smoke. Another checked his watch. The prisoners were told to stretch their legs, to take a moment before transfer. They stood by the ditch, hands in pockets against the cold, as if waiting for a train that would never come. The first shot was almost polite. The second was not. Across Germany, the scene repeated with bureaucratic precision. At Halbau, at Breslau, at Goldorf near Danzig, on village roads where children would later find brass casings in the grass, in quarries, in copses, behind police stations where the walls still hold the scars. The formula was always the same. A short drive, a cigarette, a nod, and then the report filed. Shot while trying to escape. One survivor later saw the bodies from a distance and could not move. They lined them by the road. Bram van der Stock would recall after he reached Spain. And the shots came one after another. No one ran. He did not add the part where the silence afterwards sounded like the end of the world. In a Gestapo office, a teleprinter clattered. The message was brief, the language dry as dust. 50 executed by special order. The others returned to camp. Someone stamped it, initialed it, filed it away. A crime became a line in an archive. Back at Stalag Luft 3, the gates opened one gray morning and a truck rolled in. Men gathered at the wire, searching faces. A handful of prisoners climbed down with blank eyes and dirt on their coats. They did not speak. They did not have to. Word spread hut to hut like a chill. Most would not return. The senior British officer asked the commandant for a list. It came hours later, typed, the names aligned in columns as neat as gravestones. A chaplain read them aloud in a voice that would not break. Flight Lieutenant Johnny Bull. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell. When he reached the 20th name, he paused. When he reached the 50th, no one looked up. There was no parade, no overt grief. Just small, precise acts of mourning. A mug turned upside down on a bunk. A razor tucked into a blanket and left there. A chess game frozen mid-move. The white knight angled toward a victory that no longer mattered. In Hut 104, a man folded Bushell's spare shirt, pressed the creases flat, and placed it on the pillow as if its owner might walk back at any moment. The Germans posted notices, punishment for sabotage and repeated escape attempts. The prisoners said nothing. They walked the compound in pairs, lips moving with names. At night, the camp orchestra played a slow hymn, strings fraying in the cold, and the guards did not stop it. One of them lit a cigarette and turned away. A week later, the ashes arrived from multiple police districts, parceled out like parcels from a mail order. The urns bore labels with misspelled names and incorrect ranks. The camp buried them in a row, 50 plots in the sandy soil, a chaplain's prayer bruised by wind. A small wooden cross at each head. No flags, no speeches, just the scrape of shovels and the soft thud of earth, and the understanding, heavy as concrete, that this was not justice, only interruption. News leaked in fragments through secret radios and whispered rumors. The BBC hinted at reprisals. The word moved like a knife. In London, a clerk in Air Ministry typed a memorandum with the steadiness of a man holding his breath. Evidence suggests 50 officers murdered after recapture. The paper crossed desks, brows hardened. A note in the margin, blunt as a fist. This will be answered. Van der Stock, the Dutchman who slipped through the net, made it to Madrid thin as wire and speaking with the calm of someone who had no more time for fear. Debriefers wrote as fast as he talked. Train routes, patrol schedules, faces. And then he told them about the roadside, the echo of shots, the way the birds did not return to the trees. The room went still. Pens hovered above paper. Someone closed the door quietly and said, "We will need names." In the camp, a young Canadian pilot asked the chaplain, "What's the point if they can do this?" The chaplain looked toward the cemetery and answered, "The point is that they did it anyway." The Great Escape was no longer a story about tunnels, maps, and forged tickets. It had become something heavier, a ledger written in blood and stubbornness, a declaration that even failure could be victory if it proved a man could choose his own danger. The prisoners' world shrank to wire and snow again, but their legend crossed borders faster than trains. When the thaw came, small flowers pushed up between the wooden crosses, as if the ground itself refused orders. Men stood with caps in hand and promised each name that it would not be lost to paperwork. In Britain, families began receiving letters from the Air Ministry, the sentences careful and spare. He fell as an airman and stood as a free man. Mothers held them like telegrams from another life. Inside the commandant signed new regulations and pretended not to hear the curse he had unleashed. He knew as well as anyone, war's end, paperwork remains. But somewhere past the lines, men with notebooks were already turning grief into a map, because the Allies hadn't forgotten. And when victory came, justice followed. In the camp cemetery, 50 graves stand in perfect rows. But their story didn't end there. When Allied troops reached Stalag Luft III in the spring of 1945, the war was already dying. The barbed wire sagged. The towers were empty. Snowmelt filled the trenches like silver veins. Inside the barracks, the bunks were stripped, the stove cold. On the wall, someone had scratched a single line in pencil, "For those who made it halfway." Among the liberators was a young British officer who'd once been shot down over France. He had heard whispers of the Great Escape, while in another camp, stories traded like contraband hope. Now he stood among its ghosts. "It felt," he wrote later, "like walking into a church made of silence." The bodies of the murdered airmen had already been found, scattered across Germany, buried in shallow graves under false names. The task now was to gather them, to give them back their identities, to make the record whole again. In 1947, a courtroom in Hamburg filled with the smell of ink, wool uniforms, and the nervous breathing of men who once thought themselves untouchable. The defendants, former Gestapo and SS officers, sat behind glass. Their faces were gray, older, stripped of uniforms, stripped of certainty. On the table lay folders marked Stalag Luft III, Case 3/50. Each contained a name, a photograph, a report that began with the same line: "Prisoner shot while attempting escape." The British prosecutor opened the trial with one sentence: "Gentlemen, these men were not shot escaping. They were executed escaping." Witnesses came, soldiers, villagers, even former guards. One man testified that he had driven a car full of airmen to a forest outside Gorlitz. He remembered the order, the smell of pine, the sound that came after. Another admitted to firing, claiming, "We were told. It was Hitler's will." The room fell still. The judge leaned forward, his voice ablaze. "And now it will be history's judgment." The verdict took 3 weeks. 21 men were convicted. Several were hanged. The rest vanished into prisons or silence. Justice was imperfect, incomplete, but it was real. Back in Britain, families received thin envelopes stamped Air Ministry, 1947. Inside, a letter typed on crisp paper. "Your son, Flight Lieutenant Roger J. Bushell, was among those who gave their lives following an escape from Stalag Luft III. He fell as an airman and stood as a free man." Some families framed the letters. Some burned them in quiet anger. Most simply folded them and placed them in drawers, beside photographs in uniform and telegrams that began with, "We regret to inform you." Freedom had come, but not for everyone. In the 1950s, the survivors returned to Zagen, the town that had once been Sagan. They came in civilian coats, carrying flowers and a kind of reverent disbelief. The forest was green again, the snow long gone. Only the concrete outlines of the camp remained, half buried under moss and grass. They found the cemetery at the edge of the woods, 50 graves in 2 clean rows, marked with identical white stones. The names carved deep and sure: Bushell, Bull, Kirby Green, West. Beneath each, the same inscription in English and Polish: "They died for freedom." The men stood silently, hats in hand. No speeches, just the sound of wind through the trees that had once hidden the tunnel. One of them, a Canadian pilot named Wally Floody, who had helped design the tunnels, placed a small metal cup on the earth. It was dinted, old, carried through 2 years of captivity. This, he whispered, was for the air they dug through. Another murmured, "We did get out, just not the way we planned." No one corrected him. In 1950, a permanent stone memorial was unveiled at the site. The words carved into granite still stand today. To the memory of the 50 officers of the Allied Air Forces who gave their lives following the escape from Stalag Luft 3, March 1944. Visitors began to come, soldiers, students, travelers, each drawn by a story that was no longer about escape, but endurance. Among them were Poles who had lived through occupation, Germans who had inherited silence, and young Americans who knew the story only from a film that made it seem like adventure. They would walk among the graves, then fall quiet, realizing the truth was harder and far more human. One of the surviving investigators, asked years later why the story endured, said, "Because it wasn't about getting out. It was about never giving up trying." Decades later, when the movie The Great Escape premiered in 1963, veterans filled the theater in London. The screen glowed with color and triumph. Motorcycles, sunshine, Steve McQueen. But when the lights came up, no one clapped. "They got the spirit right," one man said softly. "Just not the ending." Because the real ending wasn't glory. It was a cold morning, a line of men in snow, and a silence that the world still listens to. Every March 24th, at the cemetery in Zagan, airmen from around the world gather. The Polish Air Force stands beside British, Canadian, and American officers. They place 50 candles in the snow, one for each name. When the last is lit, the wind blows across the forest, the same forest that hid the tunnel, the same one that watched the escape. No speeches, no music, only the sound of boots crunching in the frost. They tunneled through earth to find freedom. But what they really dug was proof that no wall can cage the human spirit.